Okay, our starting point is going to pick up after your text notes from the handout last week, pages 39 to 44, just to give you some sense of where we should be picking up because all of this will fit together. So remember, we're talking about the writing, ratifying, and changes to the Constitution. All right, we are ready to talk about the ratifying part. The Constitution was signed on the 17th of September, 1787. I give you that specific a date not because I expect you to remember it. If on your deathbed one of your grandchildren can say grandpappy or grandmammy or whatever, what date was the U.S. Constitution signed, and you can still answer from memory, you have led a dull and unfulfilled life. I want you to know it just so we can kind of get a sense of how long it took between signing and ratification. Although, believe it, the district used to require as part of your test to pass for graduation that you give them the specific day, month, and year the Constitution went into effect. And that was stupid. Yeah. All right. What was required was approval by 9 of the 13 states. And one of the things we should understand about this is essentially the requirements for ratification were themselves unconstitutional because they went against the Articles requirement that amending the Articles, right, much less just replacing them, required unanimity of all 13 states. Obviously, they got away with it. And ratification was achieved on the 21st of June in 1788. Okay, and again, that specific a date is just to help you understand that there was roughly 9 months between signing and ratification. And as you can kind of see from this timeline, all 13 states do ultimately ratify the Constitution. But 2 of the major states, New York and Virginia, don't ratify it until after we have already met the requirements for the Constitution to take effect. In those 9 months, there was a lot of debate. Some of this we've already seen before. This is kind of just to summarize everything, add a little bit of information and some clarification. But we have spent time with this debate. The Federalist Papers that you guys have looked at so far, Brutus number 1. Sorry, let's see if I can drag this without closing it. That is really annoying. There we go. You guys just get to watch a middle-aged man lose to technology, which is what you expect to see. Now, we're going to look at this kind of 2 different ways. One, through the wish lists of each side, and then the second will be a comparison of what they were afraid of or not afraid of. I'm not entirely sure that starting with the wish list is best, but that's how I've done it, and so that's what we'll do. What the Federalists wanted was an elitist democracy. As if you've been wondering why on earth I ever had you read about elitist democracy versus pluralist democracy versus hyper-pluralism, this is why. The Federalists wanted the elitist flavor of democracy. So not surprisingly, their supporters often fit one of these three categories. They were wealthy merchants. These would be like large traders. Maybe they were involved in shipping across the Atlantic. Educated professionals like lawyers or physicians. And also people who owned lots of land. And as proponents of elitist democracy, they wanted as much as possible to separate the masses from control of the government. This is that Madisonian system that you've been partly diagramming starting yesterday. And so they want indirect elections for federal offices, and they want the people who are elected to those offices to be there for a long time. This insulates them from the public in two ways. Most obviously, they're not directly elected by the public. But if they have long terms, they also don't have to worry that the public will be unhappy with some decision they made while they were in office. Because if they can make an unpopular decision in maybe their first year in office, but if they're there for 6 years, right, there's 5 years for voters either to get over it or to realize that it was actually a good idea the whole time. Now, this next part, do keep your bullet points kind of lined up. Weaker states does not have to go with elitist democracy, nor does a strong central government. Yeah, but those are two things that Federalists wanted. And for Madison, the reason for this is to avoid the violence of faction. If you put more of the power in a central government that is farther away from the people where they live, you're able to water down faction. It makes it harder for people of like minds to get together across a whole large country to form a group with enough influence to take over the government. Okay? And if we have weaker states, then even if those factions can control states, they can't really do a lot of damage because they're limited to a weak state. Anti-federalists naturally have a very different wish list. They wanted pluralist democracy. Be careful with this. It's not the same as populism. Populism is generally defined as politics that are anti-elite, and that follow kind of what the majority wants in the moment, and are willing to change their politics as the public changes what it wants in the moment. That is not what the Anti-Federalists were. For one thing, lots of them are elite. That is why, because I've given you these lists of supporters, I want you to be very clear, we are specifically talking about who supported the two sides. The Federalist and Anti-Federalist leaders are all elites. Madison, on the Federalist side, is an elite. Jefferson, on the Anti-Federalist side, is an elite. He's highly educated. He's a large landowner. He owns lots of slaves. He is an elite. Matter of fact, on the Federalist side, Hamilton, even if you've not read about Hamilton, but you did watch the Broadway play, you know Hamilton's got a better claim to be the common man by background than Jefferson. But the supporters are different, and it's kind of just a mirror image. Supporters of Anti-Federalists were people who owned small businesses. They were laborers, like maybe blacksmiths or artisans. And they were small farmers, people who did not own much land. They worked the farm themselves. Even if perhaps they did own slaves, they would have worked alongside their slaves. Right? We're not talking about plantation owners that would have had overseers watching the slaves, right, that led lives of leisure. Not the slaves, the slave owners. Be clear about that. And they want direct elections for federal offices. They want the government to be answerable to the people. That's what makes them pluralists. They want everyone to have an influential say in how the government is going to work and who's going to be running it. Part of that also plays into why they want short terms for elected officials. They want officials who are going to be directly and regularly answerable to the people. That's why the House of Representatives is kind of the model of what they would have wanted. Representatives represent relatively few people, and they're up for election every 2 years. So a lot of members of Congress will say they never stop campaigning for re-election. Now, don't believe all of them when they say that. Like people like Sam Graves, he does not have to worry about being re-elected. Not at all. And if you're thinking, oh, he's picking on Sam Graves because he's a Republican, no. I mean, it's just like redistricting was really good to that guy. When he got just instead of Northwest Missouri, he got all across North Missouri, like the congressional district he absorbed. I looked up how they voted right before redistricting. The vote was, for the last congressional race, was 71% for the Republican, 29% for the Libertarian, right? Like that was a whole big block of safe votes for Sam Graves. Emmanuel Cleaver, Democrat, down, largely concentrated in Jackson County. Pretty similar situation. He's pretty safe. And they want stronger states with a correspondingly weaker central government. And this is what we saw in Brutus number 1. So Brutus is number 1 is also inspired by Montesquieu, but not the separation of powers argument of Montesquieu. Brutus number 1 was inspired by Montesquieu's writing about small republics. And what the Federalists are saying is, look, if we're going to be a country, we risk being a large republic where the leaders become too separated from the public good. So what we need to try to do is within a large republic kind of duplicate the virtues of a small republic by having strong states and only a weak central government. Okay, so the strong states can essentially act as our little republics. And then on to their fears. So there's a lot of connection between the two. Okay, Federalists want elitist democracy, in part because they are afraid of the masses, right? Which very pejoratively they refer to as mob rule. In Madison's more polished language, violence of faction, or put yet another way, tyranny of the majority. What they're not afraid of is a national government that is going to violate the rights of individuals, individual liberties. And it's not, I don't want you to think they were just naive. I mean, this may not actually make them sound less naive to some of you, but the Federalists, as part of their elitist democracy, they believed that the government would be led by gentlemen who were in government just to serve the public. They would get no benefit of serving for themselves. And if they're not going to benefit from serving the government, why on earth would they misuse government powers to violate people's rights? And that was kind of their view of how this was going to work. They were and they were pretty specific about this. They wanted people to lead who were reluctant to assume leading roles, right, who did it out of a sense of obligation rather than a sense of ambition. At the same time, their view of human nature makes them quite afraid of the majority of the public. And so if that sounds snobbish, you're not really wrong about that. Anti-federalists were, again, we've got mirror images here. They are afraid that we will creep towards a monarchical government. Okay? And they were not wrong in accusing a lot of Federalists of being friendly to the idea of making the United States eventually a monarchy. But for the Anti-Federalists, they view it as the same kind of centralized tyranny that they had not so recently fought against in the Revolutionary War. And they are afraid that there is not a clear protection in the Constitution for individual rights, which is, on the first hand, one of the reasons that we have a Bill of Rights. That was part of the concessions that they were able to extract from the Federalists. Like, look, if you want us to support this Constitution, you're going to have to promise to attach protections for individual rights. That is most of the first 10 amendments, certainly amendments 1 through 8. And then, beyond that, we also have amendment number 9, because the Anti-Federalists then became concerned, well, shoot, if we attach a list of the rights that are protected, what about some right like we forgot about or that didn't make the list? Will that right be protected? So, as a hedge, we have the 9th Amendment that says, hey, just because something isn't listed here does not mean it is not a right of the people that deserves protection. And so this kind of, that dealt with their fears and helped get us to ratification. And now for something completely different, right, changing the Constitution. We have 2 ways of changing the Constitution. We can change it formally, and we can change it informally. We only have one way of changing it formally, and that is the amendment process laid out in Article 5 of the Constitution. Which looks like this. And so there are 2 stages in the amendment process, and there's 2 ways each stage can be accomplished. The first step is to propose an amendment. Now, anybody can suggest an amendment. Lots of people have put forward all kinds of amendments that are going to go absolutely nowhere. But to propose an amendment officially, you have to have either 2/3 of the states request an amendment be proposed, so you would have to get 2/3 of states, governments, to agree to propose the same amendment. As a result, it's not surprising that that has never, ever been a method for proposing an actual amendment. I mean, it's just too difficult to get that kind of unity of purpose out of 2/3 of the states. So the other way, and the way that we have used for every amendment that has been proposed, is by supermajority 2/3 votes in both houses of Congress. And if an amendment has made it through that, it goes on to the ratification stage. And be careful with these captions here. This isn't referring to how it was proposed. Both of these, or all amendments, have been proposed this way. These captions are specifically for the next step. So all but one amendment was ratified by votes in the state legislatures of 3/4 of the states. Okay, so you can see that higher bar. 2/3 propose, 3/4 to ratify. The nice thing is, right, the fraction is always the same at each step. Right, 2/3 to propose, 3/4 to ratify. Right, our only exception where state conventions And so this would be places where you would have some way for the states to choose delegates from the public to attend state conventions to say yes or no on approving an amendment, which is obviously a more involved process than just relying on existing established state legislatures for the job, which is one of the reasons it's only been used one time. And it was a special case. The 21st Amendment is the only amendment we have had that repealed another amendment. And that was the 18th Amendment. Okay, so, and you can think if you need to keep these amendments straight, fortunately the numbering is really helpful, at least until the government decides to raise the ages for things again. At 18 you can't drink, because the 18th Amendment is prohibition. At 21 you can drink, because the 21st Amendment gets rid of, well, doesn't get rid of, but kind of, it's not that the amendment goes away, but it is repealed in the sense that it is no longer enforced. For that one, because it was unprecedented to repeal a prohibition, part of the steps of proposing was this requirement that it go to state conventions. Every other way of changing the Constitution is by some kind of informal process. And it does not mean that these changes are not significant. Some of the things we take as just fundamental bedrock elements of how government and politics works in this country are not anywhere in the Constitution. Like our two-party system. Or the actual practice of how things work in the Electoral College. Almost universally, every member of the Electoral College is what's called a faithful elector. Now, we will talk more about the Electoral College later, but for now, just at the basic level, understand that the Electoral College, the members of the Electoral College pick the president and vice president at meetings of the Electoral College in each of the states. To be an elector in the Electoral College, you pledge yourself to support the candidates from a particular party. So if you're a Republican elector, you were pledged to cast your vote for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance in the event that those two candidates won the popular vote in the state of Missouri. And almost all electors all of the time do exactly what they have said they will do. There are faithless electors, people who got onto the Electoral College with this pledge to vote for the candidates from a particular party, who then don't do that. And they're rare despite the fact that there's a large number of states where there is absolutely no consequence for being a faithless elector, and Missouri is one of those. If you were pledged to cast your vote for Trump and Vance, and you decided you didn't want to, and you wanted to cast it for Harris and Waltz, you could do that. Right? Your vote would count. There'd be no punishment. Other states have different methods of either disallowing that or even punishing it. But even without punishment, it's rare. Another element is out of the preeminence of the presidency in American policymaking, both in setting the agenda, but really in guiding the process of policymaking. For everything that you have been taught and that will be taught in this class about having three co-equal branches of government, Article 1 is the longest article that lists a ton of specific powers and even gives implied powers through things like the necessary and proper and commerce clauses. Congress, if all the members of Congress could be really united in their effort, they could be the most powerful branch of government. But in practice, the president has become increasingly powerful in American government. fourth, and one that I'm going to guess everyone has heard of at this point, judicial review. Now, all of these developed in one of the following ways, and we will look at each of these ways individually. We won't get through all of them today because I'm going to want to leave you at least a few minutes to work on your diagrams from yesterday. But judicial interpretation is one way. Political practice or custom, you could also just call it tradition. Technological changes. And finally, simply more demand for a more active government. And we will take these in order. Judicial interpretation of the informal processes, it's the one that at least has the most connection to the government's functioning as the source for the change to our constitutional process. And the most significant of these changes through judicial interpretation is, bar none, judicial review. And essentially, through the power of interpretation, the Supreme Court gave itself the power of interpretation. To make that less confusing, let's give judicial review a specific definition. It is the power not only to interpret the meaning of the Constitution, but also whether laws passed by Congress and signed by the President or executive branch actions are constitutional. And if the Supreme Court says a law is unconstitutional, it strikes it down, and that law is unenforceable. If the government is taking an action that the Supreme Court rules is unconstitutional, or even federal courts rule is unconstitutional, the executive branch must stop that action. But judicial review is not anywhere written specifically in the document. Instead, it was a power that was asserted by John Marshall when he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So the courts are known based on, especially earlier courts, we refer to them frequently by the Chief Justice, so this would be the Marshall Court. And that was the decision in Marbury versus Madison, which we will spend more time with because it is one of our foundational Supreme Court cases. For now, all you need to know is that through some kind of imaginative, I don't mean in a bad way, but it was kind of a stroke of creative genius, John Marshall was able to use this case to assert the Supreme Court's power of judicial review. There have been other changes. I will jump to the present. Most recently, in terms of how we interpret the meaning of the Constitution, especially the power of government and government officials, the decision in Trump versus United States, which happened just this year, gives presidents, while they are in office and after they leave office, absolute immunity for anything that is considered an official act of the presidency, and it is broadly defined. You can take that as a good thing, you can take that as a bad thing. Clearly, this Supreme Court decision does divide people, not just on whether they like Donald Trump or not, but also how powerful they think the presidency should be. But that really is a landmark decision that for a lot of people was kind of a radical departure from what a lot of people understood to be the meaning of the Constitution in terms of presidential power. The second way of changing things is just by how we actually practice politics and government in this country. And this is where the two-party system fits in. And an important starting point here is to remember that many of the founders, or I'm also going to introduce another way you will see them, the framers, were absolutely opposed to parties, or what they often called faction. This includes very famous founders like Adams, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington. And Adams was very clear on this point. Division of the Republic into two great parties, to be dreaded as the great political evil. And yet, before we've even reached the end of the 1700s, we've developed a system of two parties clustered around divisive issues of the time. Now, from your AP U.S. history course, or whatever your U.S. history course was, you know that what the two parties are has changed over time. But it has been two major parties, and it will stay that way, most likely. Now, I do want to be clear here, there is also an institutional element to this. How we run elections in this country helps preserve the two-party system, and is one of the reasons it developed as a two-party system. Our electoral system is based on two principles. The first, I've got them. All right, start with it in order. Popular plurality is how you win elections in the United States. For Congress, for Senate, for presidency, we'll focus on federal elections. And popular plurality means you do not have to get a majority of votes. You just have to get more votes than anybody else who is running for that same office. And we also combine that with single-member districts. So a member of Congress from each congressional district, there will only be one member of Congress. From each state, we only elect one senator at a time. And of course, for the presidency, the nation as a whole acts as one district. So all you have to do within that district is get more votes than anybody else. There are increasingly some exceptions to that, like Georgia and Louisiana that have some runoffs. There were some changes in Missouri that were suggesting going towards ranked choice voting. That's what that amendment that some of you researched a couple of weeks ago was about, and voters rejected changing away from this system of elections. I'm not entirely sure they knew that's what they were doing, but that's what they did. This is also known as the first past the post system. That's the name we get from the British, which just treats races like foot races, where whoever crosses the post, right, or passes the post or crosses the finish line first wins. Doesn't matter if they cross it first by a tenth of a second or 10 minutes. And all that matters is you were the first to cross it. That reinforces it. And so today, for that reason, plus tradition, plus some other things, the two-party system is not going anywhere. No matter whether you like it or don't like it, it's going to be our reality. Another part of this has to do with the Electoral College, and differently than we talked about it a couple of slides ago. And the point here is the Electoral College is now clearly attached to the popular vote. on a state-by-state basis, or in the cases of Nebraska and Maine, by congressional districts in the state, who wins the electoral college votes from those places is determined by who wins the popular vote in those places. And again, for most of the country, it is who wins the state. But that was not what the framers had intended. They left it open to be possible that states would determine their electors based on popular vote, but they also could have been picked by state legislatures, which would have added another layer between the popular vote and who actually is president. Over time, and this is where custom and practice certainly come in, who the electors vote for is based on popular vote. But just because none of this can be easy, we still need to know, and I'm sure a lot of you already do know, that the Electoral College distorts the popular vote, sometimes more clearly than others. In this election for president, it didn't really have a meaningful distortion because Donald Trump won the popular vote handily and the Electoral College vote handily. But in 2016, Donald Trump lost the presidential popular vote by something like 3 million votes, some 2 to 3 million votes. I think it was on the 3 side of things, and yet clearly won the Electoral College. So there are distortions. Because again, if you, like somebody in your family, or maybe if you're 18, you voted for Harrison Waltz, your vote did not get represented in any way in terms of Missouri's Electoral College delegation. All of those electors will go for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance because that's how our system works. Right? It's winner-take-all, plurality vote. And again, you can like that or not like that. If you ask me whether we should get rid of the Electoral College, I will give you the annoying answer of it depends on what you want. I will say that as Midwesterners in a state that's not pivotal to elections, like there's good reasons for people in Missouri to be a little leery of getting rid of the Electoral College, but it's a ways off. Actually, let's stop there. We'll pick this up tomorrow. We're at a nice stopping point. That gives you a few minutes. I was hoping to get you 10. All right, well, we do have announcements. So please use this time to continue working on your diagrams. It would be a great time to ask me questions about your diagrams.